The story of South Africa's emergence from apartheid to democracy will be incomplete without acknowledgement of the key role players such as Nelson Mandela and FW de Klerk, among others. That political transition led to a process that saw the drafting of the country's constitution spearheaded by two significant political leaders, the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Roelf Meyer, a former chief negotiator and current director of End Transformation Initiative. Meyer played a prominent role in negotiations that led to South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994, and at the time he was a member of the then ruling National Party led by South Africa's last apartheid president, FW de Klerk. De Klerk, as you know, passed away a few days ago. His legacy has been a talking point since his death. In the past week, on the agenda, we've been exploring his legacy by inviting various people to share their different perspectives of political legacy. Roelf Meyer joins us now live to take this conversation forward. Mr. Meyer, it is a pleasure having you on the program. Welcome to the agenda.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. de Klerk's legacy remains deeply contested. Some criticize him for perpetuating apartheid, others for ending it. Do you see it one way or the other?
Well, it's difficult for me to make a judgment on that, simply because I was close to him. I was part of the process for an extended period of time. I'm talking about the negotiations during the 1980s. And for that reason, I'm probably too subjective to make a neutral call, so to speak, on this. But I think what he did on the 2nd of February was an immense contribution towards realizing a democratic South Africa. And for that reason, we have to admit that that was the start of the process towards realizing democracy in South Africa. You know, I do a lot of work abroad in terms of conflict resolution. I was just this week in Europe working on that subject. And every time I think of our situation at the beginning of the 1990s, and I compare it with others in similar situations where it's ongoing conflict for years, then I think we can just say we were extremely fortunate that FW made that move in 1990. It could have been different. We were on the edge of a civil war, and I don't want to even think about what the consequences would have been if he didn't make that move. So full recognition of that, and I think we have to remember it for that major step. Of course, there were other moments as well. The referendum in 1992, when he took it on the chin, when there was strong opposition against the changes from within the right wing in South Africa. And he made a call to have a referendum amongst whites with the support of Mr. Mandela at the time, to say, okay, let's have it, because we needed clarity. FW was firm on that, and he made the call, and he had the referendum, and we got 70% yes vote in favor of that change. And I think that was another major step.
Let's talk about the build-up to that. I guess the current questions that people are asking: was FW de Klerk perceptive, discerning, and a visionary, or did he have no other option but to make that announcement he made back in 1990?
Well, the interesting thing is, you know, his predecessor had exactly the same choices to make for a number of years. I'm talking about P.W. Botha. There was the expected so-called Rubicon speech in 1985, at which moment P.W. was expected, the former leader, the former president at the time, when he was expected to make the announcement of the release of Mr. Mandela. He didn't do it. And then for 5 years, South Africa was suffering. It was the worst years of apartheid, that period that followed, 1985 to 1990. So the same circumstances prevailed. But when FW came immediately, took the lead, took the initiative. And the reality is, you know, whatever considerations or pressures were existing at that stage, you needed somebody who could act accordingly. And he was decisive in that. So I don't think there's any doubt about his own commitment. From a personal angle, I can recall, you know, a discussion him and I had one-to-one, just the two of us, in December of '89. In other words, about 2 months before the announcement of the 2nd of February 1999. And in that discussion in December of 89, he reflected on exactly what he was planning to do and what the meaning of that would have been. In other words, realizing a full democratic state in South Africa. And I will never forget that. In fact, that is something that was burnt into my mind. His reflection on what the meaning was. And he said it from a legal perspective. I was a lawyer too, but there was the full meaning of what the consequences would have been. In other words, bringing an end to apartheid in its full and replacing it with a full democratic state. That was his pronouncement at that point. And this was, like I said, two months before the announcement was actually made.
You were, sir, commended widely for your role in the final chapter ending the apartheid era. You also served in the first democratic government in 1994 under former President Nelson Mandela. FW de Klerk served as deputy president. How much of his role in the government of national unity was dedicated to healing the divisions and conflict of South Africa's past?
Well, the point is the realization of the government of national unity as part of the first democratic government. In other words, following the first democratic election in 94, was part of the agreement that we have reached during the negotiations. And it was an institutional transition, so to speak, from the old to the new. And FW committed himself to that. I think it was very unfortunate that he left it 2 years later. I said it publicly on various occasions. I think that was
Mr.
a big
Meyer,
mistake.
Sorry, I hate to jump in here, but we're having some...
For continuing working together.
Mr. Meyer, sorry, we're just having some issues hearing you. I think it's very, very important that we hear your full sentence there. If you could just repeat that last sentence, please, sir.
Well, what I was starting to say is that I think it was very unfortunate that he decided to leave the government of national unity only 2 years after it was instituted. He did it, I think, unfortunately, under pressure of his fellow National Party leaders who were not part of the government of national unity. And that was, I think, it had a devastating effect on the relationships in this country. So that was a mistake, but, like I said, I think there were political pressure from within. And maybe, that was unfortunately what influenced his decision.
Did he regret that, do you think?
That's very difficult to say. I had a fallout with him myself about a year later as a result of that walking out of the government of national unity, but also because, the advice I was putting forward for changes, fundamental changes that had to be made to the National Party at the time, didn't realize. And so I had a fallout with him on that. And actually immediately when this all happened, I left the National Party. I resigned from it, and I resigned from Parliament at the time. So I never picked up again on whether, that aspect bothered him, whether he had regret for that. But that was a personal decision. But nevertheless, I think, we should not fall into the trap of a debate about this. I think we have to look at the bigger picture. What he once did and had to do and did for the sake of the country was the right thing. And I think that is the overall legacy that will stick in my mind.
You say you recently returned from a trip overseas. From an international perspective, how is FW de Klerk viewed?
I have the impression he might be held in higher esteem by others who look at the situation, who looked at the situation at that time in South Africa, and still are very much aware of how important that decision was that he made, but also the impact it had on the resolving of conflict elsewhere. I went to say goodbye to Mr. de Klerk a month ago when I heard his situation, his health was deteriorating fastly. And we discussed that. And I said to him, wherever I work, South Africa is being held as a benchmark. in terms of conflict resolution. And we should, all the players that were responsible for that, from Mr. Mandela, President Ramaphosa, FW, and the rest, should all get that credit for the fact that we succeeded in bringing about that benchmark for the world. And that is why people like myself are still being called upon from South Africa's side to come and share, to exchange views on how other conflicts can be resolved. And that is what I keep on doing.
You know, Mr. de Klerk himself said in his younger years he defended what he called separate development, as he never liked the word apartheid. He said he did so when he was a member of parliament and a member of cabinet. But afterwards, he said he apologized for the pain and indignity that apartheid brought the people of color in South Africa. Some believed him, some did not. What do you make of his last words to the people of South Africa?
I think that was, you're referring to the video that was released this week, and I think that was a serious attempt from his side to correct the record, so to speak. You know, because there were instances that he was not, I think, given the right opportunity to speak for himself. I think sometimes in statements, maybe he was mistakenly recorded or his views were put forward in a different way than what he might have intended himself. And I think this was the last final attempt from his side to say, this is where I stand. You know, whether people believe it or not, that's for everyone to make a choice or a decision on that. But I think that was a serious attempt. We spoke about it when I saw him a month ago. He made mention of the fact that he did the video. And it was very clear to me that that is what he wanted to get across. And you know, at least he left the stage. He passed on in peace with his own views of the world and South Africa in particular. So I think we will keep on debating, you know, the whole subject of where we were. And I think in what he said also in the video, he was trying not to justify maybe, but giving an explanation of where he was coming from as somebody who grew up under apartheid, as a supporter of apartheid. And you know, we all of us who were part of that system can't avoid from acknowledging or admitting that. The question is, what did we do about changing that? And I think FW's contribution in changing it was phenomenal.
Do you perhaps know when that video was shot?
I'm not exactly sure, but it was very recently. In my understanding, it was very recently.
Look, he said in that video, since the 80s, his views changed completely. He said it was as if he had a conversion, and in his heart of hearts, he realized that apartheid was wrong. But how do South Africans, some who have lost, some who are still seeking answers, reckon with these words?
Yeah, like I said, you know, the debates will keep on going, and everyone, understandably and justifiably, will have their own views about this. It's not something that will just disappear suddenly, because the scars of apartheid and the damage of apartheid are too deep. Some of it is not even being reflected on. You know, from my own analysis, I always say the deepest damage that apartheid brought to this country was in the area of education. And I think we have done very little to correct that damage, and still a lot of work need to be done as far as that is. So from my perspective, I think it's good that the debate is ongoing, and also we have to be engaging with this question, because it also reflects on how we have to correct things that have still not been corrected. You know, in my perspective, and I've said it on your program, I think before, the reality is that we brought about a smooth constitutional transition through the negotiations of the 1990s. But the actual socio-economic transformation didn't follow. The implementation of the Constitution in terms of its provisions with regard to fundamental rights, human rights, as it is contained in Chapter 2 of the Constitution, have not been fully implemented. That's just part of the reality. And that is also a reflection on what we still need to do with regard to the correction of the mistakes of apartheid, of the damage of apartheid. And that's an ongoing process. And all of us who are here today in South Africa need to apply our minds and our energy in changing this and making sure that South Africans, all of us, all South Africans, the majority of South Africans, can benefit from the constitutional imperatives.
Look, as the Nelson Mandela Foundation put it, de Klerk's legacy it's a big one. It is also an uneven one, something that South Africans are called to reckon with in this moment. Mr. Meyer, we thank you very much indeed for your perspective. You are no doubt value added and a plus for the audience. Thank you very much indeed.